The dust in Copper Creek tasted like grit and fear. Dia Morgan felt it in her teeth as rough hands locked onto her arms, dragging her toward a wagon that waited like a vulture. Her heart was a wild thing, a trapped Mustang kicking against her ribs. She'd clawed her way across half a country to get here. She wasn't about to be hauled off like a sack of stolen grain. Then, through the blur of her own furious tears, she saw him. A silhouette against the dying sun, tall and solid as an old oak. His hand hovered over the butt of his pistol, a silent promise hanging in the scorching Arizona air. "You'll leave over my dead body." The voice cut through the street noise like a razor. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. In 1873, out on the unforgiving edge of the world, men didn't say things like that unless they were ready to bleed for them. And this man looked like he was born ready. His name was Preston Hayes. For 3 long, dusty weeks, he'd been on the trail of the Blackwood gang. He wasn't looking for trouble today, not this kind anyway. But seeing their leader, Jasper Blackwood, a man whose face was a roadmap of bad decisions, putting his hands on this woman, something inside Preston just snapped. It was a line drawn in the sand, a code older than any law book. "Let her go, Blackwood." Preston's voice was low, but it carried. His fingers twitched, itching for the cold steel of his Colt. .45. Jasper Blackwood turned, slow and deliberate, a predator sizing up a new threat. He had a sneer that could curdle milk. "This ain't your business, stranger. The lady's coming with us. Her brother racked up a debt he can't pay." But then the woman, Dia, found her voice. She twisted in his grip, her eyes flashing green fire. "I don't have a brother. I've never seen these men before in my life." And just like that, the whole story fell apart. A lie. This was all built on a lie. Preston took one slow step forward, the jingle of his spurs a lonely, menacing sound in the sudden quiet. The whole town had gone to ground. Shopkeepers vanished. Doors slammed shut. Windows became empty eyes, watching, waiting for the blood to flow. "Seems the lady disagrees," Preston said, his voice dangerously calm. "Maybe you ought to find another way to spend your afternoon." Blackwood's 3 men started to spread out, a wolf pack getting ready to make a kill. Their hands drifted down, hovering over their own guns. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Blackwood yanked Dia closer, using her as a shield. "You willing to die for a woman you don't even know?" he snarled. Preston's blue eyes were like ice. "Better question is, are you willing to die for a lie?" The moment stretched, thin and tight as a guitar string about to snap, 4 against 1. The odds were long. Preston knew it. He'd faced worse, but he never liked leaving things to chance. What he hadn't counted on, what nobody had counted on, was Dia Morgan herself. In a flash of pure, desperate rage, she stomped her heel down hard on Blackwood's instep. The big man grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She drove her elbow back, burying it deep in his ribs. He doubled over, the air rushing out of him in a pained whoosh. That was Preston's signal. His hand was a blur. The Colt was out, barking once before Blackwood's man even knew what was happening. The outlaw to Blackwood's right spun around, clutching a shattered shoulder, and went down in a heap. Then the world exploded in gunfire. Preston dove, rolling behind a wooden water trough as bullets chewed up the spot where he'd just been standing. Splinters flew like angry wasps. Dia scrambled for cover, her skirts kicking up clouds of dust. A bullet hit the dirt just inches from her hand, a deadly puff of brown smoke. She was exposed, a perfect target. Without a second thought, Preston broke from his cover, firing as he ran. He didn't aim to kill, just to make them duck. He grabbed Dia's arm, pulling her into the narrow, dark space behind the blacksmith's shop. "Stay down," he ordered, his hands already moving, reloading his pistol with a practiced economy of motion that spoke of 100 gunfights before this one. "I can handle myself," she shot back, her voice tight but steady. And to prove it, she reached down into her boot and pulled out a small, wicked-looking derringer. Preston couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. This woman was full of surprises. "Ma'am, I don't doubt it," he said, a grin touching his lips for a fraction of a second. "But these men mean business." "As do I," she said, her green eyes blazing. "And the name's Dia, not ma'am." A bullet ricocheted off the brick wall just above their heads, showering them with red dust. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Preston risked a look around the corner, fired twice, and was rewarded with a yelp of pain. "Pleasure to meet you, Dia," he said, turning back to her. "I'm Preston Hayes. Now you mind telling me why a man like Jasper Blackwood is so determined to have your company?" Her face was a mask of genuine confusion. "I honestly don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I just got to town yesterday. I'm the new school teacher. I'm supposed to start next week." A school teacher. From Boston. The pieces didn't fit. Outlaws didn't just ride into town and try to kidnap school teachers. There was something else going on here. Something she wasn't telling him. Or something she didn't even know herself. "Hayes!" Blackwood's voice roared from the street, echoing between the buildings. "We don't want you. Just give us the woman, and we'll ride out. No more trouble." Preston looked at Dia, really looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair coming loose from its pins, but her eyes were clear and defiant. "You trust me?" he asked. She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod. "Then follow my lead," he said. He raised his voice, pitching it so Blackwood could hear. "All right, Blackwood. Let's talk this through. No need for anyone else to get hurt." But while he was talking, his hands were moving, pointing Dia toward the back of the alley. There was a tiny gap between the blacksmith's and the general store, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was their only way out. "My horse is behind the saloon," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Gray stallion. Name's Traveler. When I start shooting, you run. Don't look back. Just get on him and ride north out of town as fast as you can. I'll find you." Fear flashed in her eyes, but it was for him, not for herself. "What about you?" He gave her that quick, confident grin again. "I've danced this dance before. Now go, on my signal." He took a deep, steadying breath, gripped his Colt, and moved to the edge of the building. He didn't wait for an answer from Blackwood. He was done talking. He stepped out and opened fire. The rapid-fire shots weren't meant to hit anyone. They were meant to draw attention, to make Blackwood's men dive for cover, to buy her a few precious seconds. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of brown hair and blue fabric as Dia slipped through the gap between the buildings. She was away. Now all he had to do was survive. The gunfight was a whirlwind of noise and smoke and the acrid smell of burnt powder. Preston was fast, but they were 3-1. He managed to wound another of Blackwood's men, a shot to the leg that sent the outlaw screaming to the dirt. But then he felt a searing pain in his left arm. A bullet had grazed him, tearing through his shirt and leaving a hot, bloody line across his bicep. He ducked back into the alley, wincing. It wasn't bad. He'd had worse shaving cuts. But it was a reminder of how close death was hovering. Just then, a new sound joined the chaos. The heavy boom of shotguns. The town sheriff, a man named Miller, had finally decided to show up for work, flanked by 2 nervous-looking deputies. Seeing the law arrive with scatterguns was enough for Blackwood's remaining men. They scrambled for their horses and galloped out of town, leaving their 2 wounded companions behind in the dust. The fight was over. For now. Sheriff Miller approached Preston cautiously, his shotgun still held at the ready. Hayes, what in tarnation was all that about? Preston was already tearing a strip from his handkerchief to tie around his bleeding arm. Blackwood gang. They tried to snatch a woman, the new school teacher. Name's Dia Morgan. You know anything about her? Miller scratched his thick beard, his eyes surveying the damage to his town. New teacher, you say? Yeah, she came in on yesterday's stage from Boston. Board of Education hired her sight unseen. Said she had good credentials. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. What in the hell would Jasper Blackwood want with a schoolmarm? That's what I aim to find out, Preston said, checking the remaining rounds in his pistol. He nodded toward the outlaw who was now being dragged toward the town's small jailhouse. Keep a close eye on that one. They'll be back for him, or to finish the job. You want me to send my deputies with you? Preston shook his head. No, Blackwood will be watching the main roads. I need to move quiet and fast. He was back on his own horse minutes later, pushing hard, heading north out of Copper Creek. The trail was faint, but Traveler was a good horse, and Dia had done exactly as he'd told her. That impressed him. In his line of work, panic was a killer, and this woman, this school teacher from Boston, seemed to have ice in her veins. He found her 3 miles out of town, tucked away in a grove of cottonwoods by a small creek. She'd been smart, leading his big gray stallion off the trail where he wouldn't be easily seen. When she heard him approach, she leveled that little derringer at his chest, her finger steady on the trigger, until she saw his face. She lowered the gun, a wave of relief washing over her features. I wasn't sure you'd make it. Preston swung down from his horse, giving Traveler an appreciative pat on the neck. He took good care of you. He's a fine horse, she said, but her eyes were fixed on the bloody handkerchief tied around his arm. You're hurt. It's nothing, he said, dismissing it with a wave. His gaze swept back toward the direction of town. We need to keep moving. Blackwood isn't the type to give up. But why? She asked, the confusion returning to her face. Why does he want me? I have nothing. I am nobody. Preston pulled his canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. That, he said, his eyes meeting hers, is what we're going to figure out. He took in her appearance, a proper lady from Boston, dressed for a classroom, now covered in dust and holding a pistol. You said you came from Boston, looking for something different. A small, weary smile touched her lips. Everyone told me I was mad to come west alone. Maybe they were right. Trouble found you quick enough, he admitted. Her chin lifted a fraction. I didn't ask for your help, Mr. Hayes. No, you didn't, he agreed. But I offered it all the same. He tightened the cinch on Traveler's saddle. We need to find a safe place to hole up, somewhere he won't think to look. I know a place, an old mining cabin in the foothills, about a half a day's ride from here. And then what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Preston looked at her, the setting sun catching the red highlights in her chestnut hair. Then, he said, his voice low and serious, we figure out why Jasper Blackwood and his entire gang are willing to risk getting killed over a Boston schoolteacher they claim they've never met. They rode double on Traveler, Preston in the saddle, Dia seated behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist. He could feel the tension in her, the coiled spring of fear and adrenaline. He pushed the big stallion hard, taking them away from the main trails, following dry creek beds and winding game paths that would be nearly impossible for Blackwood to follow. The sun was setting, painting the rugged landscape in shades of orange and purple. As they rode, he got her to talk. He learned she was 24, an orphan since influenza had taken her parents 3 years prior. The job in Copper Creek wasn't just a job, it was an escape, a chance to outrun the ghosts that haunted her back east. What about you, Mr. Hayes? She asked, her voice close to his ear as they navigated a steep, rocky incline. "You're no ordinary cowhand." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Your speech, for one thing, and the way you handled yourself back there. That wasn't just luck, that was training. She was sharp, he'd give her that." "Captain, Union Army," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He hadn't used that title in years. "After the war, I tried going home. Back east. It didn't take. Too many ghosts of my own." "So you came west," she said. "So I came west," he echoed. "Did some scouting for the Army, a little bounty hunting. Now I mostly work for Wells Fargo, protecting shipments, tracking down men who think they can just take what isn't theirs." "Is that why you were in Copper Creek? A job for Wells Fargo?" He hesitated for a moment. "Not exactly. I was after Blackwood. He and his gang hit a stagecoach 3 weeks ago. It was carrying a Wells Fargo payroll." He left out the part about the 2 guards and the passenger they'd killed in cold blood. She didn't need to hear that right now. But as he said it, a thought began to form in the back of his mind. A missing piece of the puzzle he hadn't considered. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, small, solid, and hidden. It was tucked into a hollow on a steep hillside, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks nearby, providing clean, cold water. He'd stocked it months ago with the basics: coffee, beans, jerky, and most importantly, ammunition. As dusk settled into a deep, star-filled night, he built a small, smokeless fire in the stone hearth. Dia, without being asked, took the medical kit from his saddlebags and began to properly clean and bandage his wounded arm. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, yet firm and confident. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her work. "I volunteered in a hospital during the war," she explained, her eyes focused on the task. "I was young, but they needed every pair of hands they could get." He felt a new wave of respect for her. This wasn't some fragile flower from the city. She'd seen things. She'd survived. "I'm sorry you got pulled into my mess with Blackwood." She finished tying the bandage and met his gaze. The firelight flickered in her green eyes. "It seems I was already in it, whether I knew it or not." She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill passing through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "So, what do we do now?" "Tomorrow, I scout our back trail, make sure we weren't followed," he said. "Then, we are going to talk, and you are going to tell me everything. Every person you talked to on your way out here, every letter you received, something, somewhere, connects you to Blackwood. We just have to find it." That night she took the cabin's single cot. He took the floor by the door, his Colt resting on his chest. He didn't sleep much. Every sound in the night, every rustle of leaves, every distant coyote howl had his hand reaching for his gun. He was protecting more than just a witness now. He was protecting Dia. And he wasn't entirely sure why that felt so damn important. Before the sun had even kissed the horizon, he was up, making coffee. The rich aroma filled the small cabin, and he saw her stir on the cot. She sat up, her long chestnut hair unbound and falling around her shoulders. In the soft, pre-dawn light, she looked younger, more vulnerable. And he couldn't deny it. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, fragile way of the women he'd known back east, but with a raw, natural strength that seemed to belong to this wild country. "I hope you slept well," he said, handing her a tin cup of the steaming black coffee. "Better than I expected," she admitted, her hands wrapping around the cup's warmth. "What's the plan?" "First, I check our back trail," he repeated. "I need to know if he's out there, sniffing around. You stay here. Keep the door barred." "Keep this," he said, nodding to her derringer. "Close." She nodded, her expression serious. "Be careful, Preston." He rode out, making a wide, slow circle around the cabin, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of pursuit. He found nothing. No broken twigs, no fresh tracks, nothing. That should have been a relief. Instead, it put him on edge. Jasper Blackwood wasn't a man who gave up. Losing 2 of his gang members would have made him angry, not scared. If he wasn't on their trail, it meant one of 2 things. Either they truly lost him, or he was planning something else, something worse. When he got back to the cabin, he found Dia had swept the floor and was heating water to wash. She'd also found his small stash of books, a few worn-out classics, and a pile of cheap dime novels. She held one up, a lurid cover depicting a hero named Dead-Eye Dan. A smile played on her lips. "I didn't take you for a reader of such fine literature, Mr. Hayes." He laughed, the sound genuine and unforced. "A man gets lonely on the trail. Besides, Dead-Eye Dan gets the job done." The light-hearted moment faded as they sat down at the small, rough-hewn table. They spent the next 2 hours going over every detail of her journey west. The stagecoach company she used, the towns she passed through, the people she met at the way stations. Nothing. It was all frustratingly ordinary, a dead end at every turn. Preston paced the small cabin, the gears in his mind grinding. "It has to be the stagecoach," he said, stopping suddenly. "The one Blackwood robbed. That's the only connection." "But I wasn't on that stagecoach," she insisted. "The robbery was 3 weeks ago, near Tucson. I came through St. Louis 2 weeks ago. I was hundreds of miles away." "I know," Preston said, his eyes narrowing in thought. "The strongbox on that stage had the Wells Fargo payroll. Yes. But there was something else, something I didn't think was important at the time." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "There was a pouch of documents from the Department of the Interior." Dia stared at him, her expression blank. "What kind of documents?" "I don't know. Land surveys, maybe? It wasn't my concern. My job was the payroll." He started pacing again, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. "But what if the money was just a bonus? What if the documents were the real prize? What if Blackwood took something? And now he needs you to make it work. A key, a signature, something." "But I'm just a school teacher," she protested, her voice rising in frustration. "I don't know anything about government documents." Preston stopped and turned to face her, his voice quiet and deadly serious. "Are you? Or is there something else? Anything at all you haven't told me? A family connection? Anything to do with land or mines or the government?" She looked away. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. She was hiding something. "Dia," he pressed, his voice gentle but firm. "I can't help you if you don't trust me." She let out a long, shaky breath and finally met his eyes. "There is something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it seemed so irrelevant, so unimportant." "Let me be the judge of that." "My uncle," she began, her words coming in a rush. "My mother's brother, William. He passed away last year. He worked for the Department of the Interior. He supervised land surveys out here, in the territories." She paused, taking another breath. "When he died, he left me a small inheritance, and a box of his old papers. I never really looked through them. I thought it was just personal things, letters, maybe some old maps he'd drawn." A cold dread washed over Preston. It was like watching the tumblers of a lock fall into place. Click, click, click. "Dia," he said, his voice tight. "Where are those papers now?" Her eyes widened as the realization began to dawn on her as well. "They're in my trunk," she whispered, her face going pale. "Back at the boarding house, in Copper Creek." There it was. The connection, the reason. It wasn't about a phantom brother or a manufactured debt. It was never about her at all. It was about what was in that trunk, something her uncle had left her. something valuable enough to send Jasper Blackwood and his killers after her. "We have to go back," Preston said, his mind already racing. "We have to get those papers before he does." Night fell like a black shroud over the mountains. They sat by the fire, the coffee long gone, a heavy silence hanging between them. The plan was desperate, maybe even foolish. At first light, they would ride back towards Copper Creek, try to slip into town unnoticed, and get to her trunk. It was a long shot. Blackwood would be watching the town. He'd have men everywhere. Dia stared into the flames, her face a canvas of flickering light and shadow. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. "You could have ridden away after the gunfight. You could have left me in that town. Why risk your life for me?" Preston thought about it. He thought about the long, lonely years since the war, the endless miles on the trail, hunting men for money, searching for a justice that always seemed just out of reach. He'd been looking for something to believe in again, something worth fighting for. He looked at her quiet strength, her fierce determination, the unexpected kindness in her hands when she'd bandaged his arm. "When I saw Blackwood dragging you towards that wagon," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name, "I saw something that was just wrong. And some things a man just can't walk away from. Not if he wants to be able to look at himself in the mirror in the morning." Their eyes met across the small firelit cabin. And in that one, long look, Preston knew this wasn't just about a job anymore. It wasn't about Wells Fargo's stolen payroll or a mysterious set of papers. It was about her. This woman had woken up a part of him he thought had died on a battlefield years ago. And that scared him more than Blackwood's entire gang. The ride back was tense, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind sounding like approaching hoofbeats. They stopped at midday, hiding in a cluster of massive boulders that overlooked the main trail to Copper Creek. While the horse drank from a small trickle of water, they shared the last of the jerky. "If it is these papers," Dia said, her voice low, "what could possibly be in them that's worth so much?" "In this territory, land," Preston said simply. "Land is everything. Water rights, mineral claims, where the railroad decides to lay its tracks. That's where the fortunes are made. If your uncle was a surveyor, he knew where the gold was before anyone else even knew there was a mountain." "And Blackwood wants that information," she finished, "to stake the claims for himself, or sell it. Either way, he's willing to kill for it," Preston said grimly. As he spoke, a sound drifted up from the trail below. The unmistakable sound of shod horses on rock, many of them. Preston drew his Colt instantly, motioning Dia to get down behind the rocks. He crept to the edge and peered over. 6 riders, moving at a steady pace, heading away from Copper Creek in the direction of the cabin. At the lead was Jasper Blackwood, his face a thundercloud of frustration. But riding beside him was someone new. A man in a clean, dark city suit and a derby hat, looking completely out of place in the rugged landscape. Preston's blood ran cold. He scrambled back to Dia. "It's Blackwood," he whispered, his voice urgent. "And he's not alone. He's with some city fella. They're heading for the cabin." "They know," she breathed, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone told them where we were." "The outlaw we left behind," Preston guessed. "The sheriff must have gotten it out of him." His mind was racing, reevaluating everything. "This changes the plan. We can't go into town, not now. It'll be a trap. They'll have men watching every street." "Then what do we do?" Preston looked east, across the plains. "We need help," he said, making a decision. "There's a ranch about 10 miles that way. Belongs to a man named Matthew Wilcox. He's a friend, and he owes me a favor." They waited, hidden in the rocks, until Blackwood's posse was long out of sight. Then they rode, not towards Copper Creek, but away from it, pushing their horses hard across the open country. The sun was a fiery ball on the horizon when they finally saw the sprawling adobe and timber ranch house of the Wilcox spread. Matthew Wilcox, a big man with a weathered face and kind eyes, met them on the porch, a Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. He lowered it as soon as he recognized Preston. "Hayes! Didn't expect to see you ride in," he said, his eyes flicking to Dia and the urgency on Preston's face. "And with company, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Preston said, swinging down from the saddle. "We're in trouble, Matt. Bad trouble." Over a hot meal, Preston laid out the whole story. Wilcox and his son, Thomas, a young man whose life Preston had saved from a flash flood 2 years back, listened in stunned silence. "So this man Blackwood is working with someone else?" Wilcox asked, his brow furrowed. "Someone with money." "That's how it looks," Preston said. "The man in the suit. He didn't look like a common outlaw. He looked like a businessman. A railroad man, maybe. Or from a mining company." Later that night, after Wilcox had shown them to separate guest rooms, Preston found Dia standing in the darkened hallway, unable to sleep. "I keep going over it in my head," she whispered, her arms wrapped around herself. "The job offer. It came out of nowhere. A letter, just a few weeks after my uncle died. It was on letterhead from the Copper Creek Board of Education, but what if it was fake? What if it was all a lie, right from the start?" The possibility was chilling. "You think someone lured you out here?" Preston asked. "Someone who knew you had the papers?" "I think," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's the only thing that makes any sense. It was a setup, a cold, calculated plan to bring a lone woman halfway across the country, carrying a treasure she didn't even know she possessed, and deliver her right into the hands of waiting killers. The stakes of this game had just gotten infinitely higher. The next day, a new plan was hatched. Thomas Wilcox, being a local and a familiar face, would ride into Copper Creek and see what he could learn. He came back in the afternoon, his face grim. "Blackwood's men are all over town," he reported. "They're watching the boarding house, the livery, the saloon. They're not even trying to hide it." He hesitated. "And something else, Preston. Sheriff Miller. He's gone." "Gone where?" Wilcox demanded. "No one knows. His deputy said he rode out yesterday morning to check on a disturbance, and just never came back. People are getting scared." Preston and Wilcox exchanged a dark look. A missing sheriff wasn't a good sign. It meant Blackwood, or whoever was pulling his strings, was growing bolder. They were taking over. "He's either been bought, or he's been buried," Preston said flatly. "Either way, we're on our own. We have to get those papers tonight." The new plan was even riskier than the last. Thomas would create a diversion, a small fire in an old, abandoned shed on the north side of town. While the town was distracted, Preston and Dia would slip in from the south, get the papers, and get out. As dusk fell, they rode out, disguised in borrowed ranch clothes. They left their horses hidden in a grove of trees and crept towards the town on foot, sticking to the shadows like ghosts. Soon they saw the orange glow in the sky and heard the faint shouts of alarm. The diversion was working. The back door of the boarding house was unlocked. They slipped inside, the house eerily silent. They moved up the stairs, every creak of the floorboard sounding like a thunderclap. Dia's room was just as she'd left it. She went straight to the trunk at the foot of her bed, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key. "Hurry!" Preston urged, keeping watch from the window. She threw open the lid, pushing aside dresses and books until her fingers closed around a worn leather document case. "Here," she breathed, pulling it free. "These are it." At that exact moment, Preston saw movement on the street below. One of Blackwood's men, ignoring the fire, was heading back towards the boarding house. "We've got company," he hissed. "Let's go." They didn't make it to the stairs. The front door of the house crashed open, and heavy boots stomped inside. "Upstairs!" a gruff voice yelled. "Check her room, now!" They were trapped. Preston pulled Dia into the nearest room across the hall, closing the door just as footsteps pounded up the stairs. They heard the door to Dia's room being kicked open. "She's been here," a voice shouted. "The trunk's open." "Search the whole house," another voice commanded. It was Blackwood himself. Preston looked at the window. It was their only way out. Below was the sloped roof of a woodshed. It was a dangerous jump, but staying was certain death. Dia looked at him, her eyes wide, and nodded, clutching the precious document case to her chest. He slid the window open. He helped her out and she slid down the roof, landing with a soft thud in the darkness below. Preston followed just as their door burst open. A gun fired, the bullet splintering the window frame next to his head. He threw himself out, hit the roof hard, rolled, and dropped to the ground. "Run!" he yelled, firing back into the house to slow them down. They fled into the night, a desperate, scrambling race through the backyards of Copper Creek. Shouts and more gunshots echoed behind them. They reached their horses, leaped into the saddles, and spurred them into a dead run, heading for the one place they might be able to lose them. "The river!" Preston yelled over the thunder of hooves. "If we can make it to the river, we have a chance." They crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. The Silverado River appeared ahead, a ribbon of moonlight in the darkness. They didn't slow down, plunging their horses into the cold, shallow water, turning downstream to hide their tracks. After what felt like an eternity, Preston led them up the opposite bank and into a thick stand of cottonwood trees. They were safe. For a moment. "Let's see what was worth all this," Preston said, breathing hard. By the faint light of the moon, Dia opened the document case. Inside were rolled up maps and sheaves of paper. She spread the first map out on a fallen log. "Land surveys," she whispered, her finger tracing the lines. "Of the Verde Valley." Preston looked over her shoulder, his breath caught in his throat. He knew the area. Rich land, prime for ranching. But then she unfolded another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Department of the Interior. It was a geological report. "My God," Preston breathed. "Silver. Massive deposits of silver and copper." Dia's hands were shaking as she unrolled the last document. It wasn't a map. It was a letter. A letter from her uncle, addressed to her. As she read it, all the color drained from her face. "He knew," she whispered, her voice filled with a horrified understanding. "He knew someone was after this." The letter laid it all bare. Her uncle had discovered the silver during a routine survey for a proposed new railroad route. Before he could file his official report, he'd been approached by powerful men who tried to bribe him. When he refused, they threatened him. Fearing for his life, he'd hidden the real maps and sent them to his unsuspecting niece in Boston, the one person no one would ever suspect. "The teaching job," Dia said, looking up at Preston, her eyes dark with the terrible truth. "It was all a lie, a trap to lure me and these papers out west." "And Blackwood was the man they sent to spring the trap," Preston finished. But who were they? Who had this kind of power? The answer came riding out of the darkness. The thunder of hoofbeats surrounded them before they could even react. Preston shoved Dia behind him, drawing his Colt, but he knew it was hopeless. They were surrounded. But when the riders emerged into the clearing, it wasn't Jasper Blackwood at their head. It was the man in the city suit. And behind him, slumped in his saddle with his hands tied, was the bruised and beaten Sheriff Miller. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Hayes," the man said, his voice smooth as poison. I believe you have something that belongs to me. And you are, Preston demanded, his gun still leveled at the man's chest. The man gave a small, condescending smile. Edward Cantrell. I represent the Western Pacific Railroad, and those surveys are company property. They're government property, Dia shot back, her voice shaking with rage. A minor detail, Cantrell said with a dismissive wave. My employers have an arrangement. Your uncle, unfortunately, refused to honor it. He took a step forward. I hired Mr. Blackwood to retrieve the documents. He was supposed to be discreet. Instead, the fool got greedy and decided he'd rather sell the information himself. He complicated matters. I am here to uncomplicate them. So that was it. Not one enemy, but two. Blackwood and Cantrell, both after the same prize, with Dia and Preston caught in the middle. Give me the surveys, Cantrell said, his voice hardening, and you can walk away. The railroad is prepared to be generous for your trouble. And if we refuse? Dia asked. Cantrell's pleasant mask dropped. Then Sheriff Miller here will have no choice but to arrest you for theft, and for the murder of his deputy. The captured sheriff looked up, his one good eye pleading with them. Don't listen to him, Hayes, he rasped. They killed Frank when he wouldn't go along. One of Cantrell's men silenced him with a vicious blow. Preston's mind raced. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered. There was no way out. The papers go to the governor in Prescott, Preston said, his voice a low growl. Let the law sort it out. I'm afraid, Cantrell said, his hand dropping inside his coat, that I can't allow that. But just as he moved, a single rifle shot cracked from the trees behind him. One of Cantrell's men cried out and toppled from his saddle. The clearing erupted into chaos as more shots rang out and riders burst from the surrounding forest. It was Wilcox. Matthew Wilcox and his son, and a half-dozen of his toughest ranch hands, rifles blazing. Preston didn't hesitate. He grabbed Dia, pulling her behind a large boulder as the air filled with lead. He returned fire, the world narrowing to muzzle flashes and the screams of men. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. When the smoke cleared, Cantrell was on the ground, clutching a wounded leg. Two of his men were dead, and the rest had their hands in the air. Wilcox walked into the clearing, his rifle still smoking. Figured you might need a hand, he said with a grim understatement. The journey to Prescott, the territorial capital, took 3 days. They traveled with their prisoners, Cantrell and his men, securely tied. Sheriff Miller, his wounds tended by Dia, rode alongside them, ready to tell his story. Along the way, something shifted between Preston and Dia. The shared danger had forged a bond between them, a connection deeper than words. Governor Safford listened to their story with a stone-faced gravity, his anger growing as he examined the stolen maps and her uncle's letter. This is corruption at the highest level, he declared. Your uncle was an honest man, Miss Morgan. I will see that he gets justice. I'm dispatching federal marshals immediately. The Western Pacific Railroad has a great deal to answer for. Cantrell and his men were hauled off to the territorial prison. Wanted posters for Jasper Blackwood were sent out across the territory. The immediate danger was over. That evening, Preston found Dia on the balcony of their hotel, looking out at the sunset over the mountains. You're safe now, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. And what now? She asked, turning to him. Do I go back to Boston, or do I try to be a schoolteacher in a town that will only ever remember me as the woman who brought a war to their main street? What do you want to do, Dia? She looked out at the vast, wild landscape. I came west to find a purpose, a place where I mattered. I'm not sure what that looks like anymore. He took a chance. He reached out and took her hand. The territory is a big place, he said. The governor offered me a job, overseeing security for the new land offices up north. Less traveling, more stability. He looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He said they're always looking for smart, brave people, and I find myself in need of a partner. Her eyes searched his, and a slow smile spread across her lips. That sounds suspiciously like a proposition, Mr. Hayes. Maybe it is, Miss Morgan, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The kiss that followed was a promise, a beginning. It was gentle and fierce all at once, a release of all the fear and tension, and the start of something new and terrifying and wonderful. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I should warn you, he murmured. I'm not an easy man. We all have scars, Preston, she replied, her hand coming up to touch his cheek. The question is whether we let them define us. 2 weeks later, they stood on the porch of a small, weathered house on the edge of the growing town of Flagstaff. It needed work, but it looked out over a valley of ponderosa pines and the distant, majestic San Francisco peaks. It was a place to put down roots, a place to build a life. I want this, Dia said, her voice firm with a certainty that amazed him. All of it, the house, the territory. She turned and took both of his hands in hers. And you, if you'll have me. He pulled her close, the memory of that day in Copper Creek still so vivid in his mind. I said it once, and I meant it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You'll leave over my dead body. She laughed, a sound like music. That's not a very traditional proposal. We're not very traditional people, he smiled. But if you want traditional, Dia Morgan, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her answer was another kiss, full of all the promise of the years to come. They were married a month later, with Governor Safford himself officiating. Matthew Wilcox and Sheriff Miller stood as their witnesses. The story of the schoolteacher and the gunslinger who brought down a corrupt railroad became a legend in the territory. Blackwood was finally caught a year later, trying to rob a bank in Tucson. He was sent to prison for 20 years. Edward Cantrell and his employers at the railroad faced a federal investigation that exposed their crimes to the nation. Justice, slow but certain, had been served. Years passed. Preston became a U.S. Marshal. Dia founded the first public library in Flagstaff. They filled the small house with love and laughter, and with 2 children, a daughter named Emma and a son they named William. The wild, untamed land had tested them, had tried to break them, but together they had found more than just a purpose. They had found a home. On their 10th anniversary, Preston took Dia back to the old mining cabin in the foothills. It was still standing, a silent monument to the terrifying days that had thrown them together. Do you ever regret it? He asked, as they sat by a small fire under a sky impossibly vast and filled with stars. Coming west, marrying a man with more scars than prospects. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Not for a moment, she whispered. I came looking for an adventure. I found that, and I found you. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. I knew who you were from the moment you stepped into that street. You were a man who meant what he said. In a world of empty promises, that's rarer than silver or gold. He kissed her, a deep sense of peace settling over him for the first time in his life. The war, the lonely trails, the ghosts of his past, they had all led him here, to her. The woman he once vowed would leave only over his dead body had become the one person he couldn't live without. And in the heart of the wild Arizona territory, that was the only treasure that ever truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the Wild West.